Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thank you so much for joining the conversation today. The built environment accounts for about 40% of annual CO2 emissions globally. In the industrial era, home was where the carbon is, and an MIT urban and environmental study recently reported that the materials used to build a new home can generate between 15 and 100 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. It's critical that we reduce the emissions from building and keep the costs of homes affordable after they've more than doubled since the 2007 financial crisis. A rising movement in the construction industry, known as passive net zero home design, can reduce the embodied carbon footprint. That's the CO2 created just from producing and shipping the building materials along with the energy impact of a building project. We can reduce the embodied carbon footprint of a new home and provide long-term energy solutions that cut emissions and monthly bills. Our guest today is Mike Anderson, CEO and design leader at Passive Design Solutions, a pioneer in the industry who has more than 100 passive house projects in their portfolio. Passive Design Solutions offers downloadable passive and net zero home plans that a certified construction professional can build. Mike's partner, Natalie Leonard, wrote about passive house designs for Earth911 last year, and we wanted to get his thoughts on the evolution of this sustainable building technology, the market for environmentally responsible single and multifamily homes, and some of the improvements that we can all make without upgrading to a new house. You can learn more about Passive Design Solutions and find their home plans at passivedesign.ca. Passive Design's all one word, no space, no dash, passivedesign.ca. Welcome to the show, Mike. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for joining us and talking about passive net zero home design. And that's what I want to start off with. We've heard about passive home design for a while and covered it on Earth911. How's a net zero passive home different than just a passive home?
Yeah, basically net zero means that the house is going to produce as much power over the course of the year as it uses.
Okay.
So a passive home is a home that just needs less power. A net zero home then takes that a little step further and produces all of the power that it needs.
Does that simply mean you add solar to the design and it takes care of it? How do you generate that necessary energy?
Yeah, generally it means solar. Solar panels have shown themselves to be the best cost-effective, reliable, residential scale way of producing power. That's not to say that, if we designed our neighborhoods differently, you couldn't do it some other way. But
Sure.
But at the residential scale, solar panels are generally how people do it.
Now, the other thing I want to clarify at the get-go is what we mean by net zero. Does that mean that the embodied carbon footprint of the house, which MIT has estimated is anywhere from 15 to 100 tons of CO2, is negative when the home is finished? Or how do you explain net zero quantitatively?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, net zero does not generally relate to embodied carbon. So embodied carbon is the carbon that's released into the atmosphere in order to make the materials to make the home and to make the home itself. So that means if we think about lumber, that means the gas used in the chainsaw to cut the tree down, to then truck it to a mill, to run the mill, to kiln dry it, all of those things. Foam, concrete, cellulose, asphalt shingles, they all have different amounts of carbon involved in making them and getting them to a construction site. Net zero generally just relates to what we call operational energy or operational power. Okay. So that means what's your power bill at the end of the year? A net zero home, it'll be zero, but you can get to net zero by investing tons of carbon and never offset that. So there's a few different ways of getting there.
Is the goal, though, over the long term for the house to become net zero, including the embodied carbon?
Yeah. So I mean, the terminology that I've heard, the terminology is confusing, but the terminology that I've heard is either net negative or, annoyingly, net positive. Both of them are taken to mean that the house actually produces more power than it uses, which means it's able to, assuming that's renewable power, then that's able to kind of offset some of the fossil fuels that went into making it in the first place. Net negative is more accurate, but it sounds bad, so people say, climate positive or something similar to make it sound better.
We do have a tendency to make up some weaselly language.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
How affordable are these today? These are passively heated and cooled homes.
Yeah.
Are they becoming easy to purchase?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it a couple of different ways. So, are they becoming easier to purchase? Certainly, compared to 10 years ago, when in North America this was relatively new.
Well, you couldn't even find them basically 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. And now, there have been enough built that you might actually find one for sale. There's certainly a big uptick in interest, and people are building them. So they are available in that sense. They are not the same price. They do cost more money. For sure, because there's more materials and there's more labor, so they have to cost more money. There are certain ways that offsets by not needing furnaces and other things that it doesn't have to cost a lot more, but it's going to cost a little more. The reality is that what's driving construction costs right now is not insulation. Insulation is relatively inexpensive as far as things go. What's driving construction costs is other stuff like labor and land cost and supply chain issues. That's having a much, much larger effect than the insulation value of a home.
Do you see the cost of these materials, though, declining as there's more demand for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So passive house is not a prescriptive path. So what I mean by that is it doesn't tell you how to build a passive house. As a standard, it just says how well it needs to perform. There's actually lots of different ways of skinning that particular cat. So you can approach it with really high tech, expensive materials and methods. One of the best examples I heard of this kind of high tech passive house was a cat door. The client wanted to have a cat door, and so they put an RFID tag into the cat's collar, so it have an automated double door system that opened and closed without letting
an airlock for the cat.
An airlock for the cat, exactly. Is that one way of doing it? Of course, that's one way of doing it. We're looking for airtightness. I don't care. The other option, of course, is just not to give the cat a cat door. So one of the things that we really tried to do as a firm is we tried to approach passive house saying, okay, what if we had nothing fancy? What if everything that we got to build a house with, you had to get at Home Depot? There's no reason you can't build a passive house out of stuff from Home Depot. Insulation is insulation. And if we need more of it, we just add layers in different ways than people are building.
Well, let me ask about some of the key characteristics of a passive house, and in the context of how could we potentially upgrade existing homes or apartments too. So in terms of the sealed space, how should a passive home move and provide fresh air?
Yeah, that's a great question. Air tightness is absolutely critical. It does not matter what climate you're in, although the colder your climate is, the more critical it is. But every climate benefits from controlling airflow in and out of the house, okay? And what we've discovered is that humans need to breathe. And so you do need to get fresh air into the house. However, humans breathe through their lungs, not their skin. Buildings should be the same. You don't just trust fresh air to come from whatever hole happened to be left behind when the builder walked away from the job. We move it through a ventilation system. This is, the building code is kind of moving towards this more and more, differences regionally, of course. But what we're looking at is, especially in cold climates and in very hot climates, at heat recovery ventilation. So what that means...
Is that shorthand for a heat pump?
No, that's not a heat pump. Yeah.
Okay.
So a heat pump is a different system. Heat recovery ventilation, or an HRV, is when you bring fresh air in from outside and you push your stale air out from inside, and you flow those two airs past each other in a heat exchanger. So that your bathrooms, kitchens, where there's humidity, where there's smells, where we want to rid of that air. We're going to push that out of the house and we're going to suck in fresh air, give that to the bedrooms, the living room, and we're going to exchange the heat on the way. Or if you're in a hot climate, exchange the cooling on the way. But it works the same for both. So it maintains the climate inside while providing fresh air where you want.
So in terms of the installation, are there environmentally responsible installations that you recommend people use in addition to just the idea of using more insulation to
Absolutely.
space?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, passive house, the standard, does not weigh in, other than to say that you can't trust spray foam as an air tightness method. Other than that, it does not really have anything to say about what particular insulation you use. But once we go with air tightness, we know that the next thing to get, to really reduce your operational carbon, heating and cooling, is to super insulate. Okay. Mm-hmm. And some insulations are really, really bad for the environment on their own, especially certain types of foam that use, they're called blowing agents in their manufacturing. So that when they pump them up to make them foamy, some of those blowing agents have a very high global warming potential. They're not CO2 exactly, but they're other global warming agents.
CO2 equivalents.
Yeah, exactly. And they're brutal. They are really, really brutal. And, it depends on whose math you use, but I've seen some where, some of these foams need to be in a building offsetting heating costs for 100 or 200 years before you paid for the carbon just to make it in the first place, okay? So certainly there are better and worse insulations. The best by far is cellulose from an embodied carbon perspective. It has certain other difficulties when it comes to working with it, but from an embodied carbon perspective, cellulose is by far the best. And cellulose just means plant. It's just plant fiber. The way that we mostly get that is recycled newspaper at the moment. That's what most cellulose is. So it's, it is a waste stream, and it takes that carbon out of that waste stream, puts it in a building where it can sit for a long, long time. And arguably, depending on the thickness of the walls, and again, whose math you're using, these cellulose-based insulated walls might be carbon neutral or even carbon negative in themselves, the embodied carbon of them.
So now let's turn to windows. What kinds of windows? We hear about triple pane, gas-filled sealed windows, energy star ratings. What do you look for when you're choosing a window?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And the answer to that, along with a lot of how much insulation you need is another question. The answer to that is really, it depends on where you live and what your climate is like. So for instance, if you're in, a warmish part of California, going from a single pane to a double pane might be all you need to do. But certainly in most of Canada, triple panes are worth the money. In Minnesota, Wisconsin. It depends a little bit on your climate, but there are advantages and disadvantages to kind of going up. Generally, you probably want to do a little bit better than what your building code's requiring. That's probably a good way of going about it. In terms of the gas fill and the coatings, there's 1,000 different options there. And usually we're only making a difference of 1%, 2% of performance of a house when we start getting down to that level of detail. That can be important, but it's probably not your low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, now you just gestured at the question of home value.
Yeah.
Does all of this investment raise the perceived value of a home on the market today?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question, and one that I don't feel like I can authoritatively answer, but I do have a fun story about it.
Okay.
So in theory, reducing energy bills increases the value of the home. Most potential home buyers will ask to see power bills. That's a fairly standard thing now. If you have, for instance, a net zero home with no power bill, that does have a real economic impact. Okay. However, to test this question, we decided a few years ago, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, to build a spec home in Halifax, which is where we're based, and sell and see if we could sell our spec home for more than the neighbor's kind of normal code built house if it was passive house certified. Okay. So we designed a house, built a house, The neighbor built a house. Theirs was 3 stories high. Ours was 2 stories high. There were a bunch of little differences.
Mm-hmm.
We ended up selling it for, I think, $30,000 or $35,000 more than the neighbor, even though the house was a little bit smaller. So we were like, look at this. We proved it. Passive House has this massive premium in the market. It's amazing. However, we ended up actually in the building when the new owner came over, and she did not know that we were the designers. She thought that we were working for the real estate agent. And as we were talking with her, she said, I love the house. It's great. It's bright. It's sunny, fresh air. But would you believe what they said about energy bills? Who would believe that? Why did they even bother? And it turns out she had bought the house at a premium, not because of the Passive House certification. She didn't know what Passive House certification was and didn't care. She thought it was just a nicer home. It was sunnier. It had fresh air. It smelled better. There was less of a VOC smell in there. And what that brought home to me was not so much that there is a price to having a plaque, which is not well recognized enough. There's actually a benefit to having a passive house.
It's just a more pleasant place to live.
It's just a nicer place to live. Yeah. The size of the window, certain principles that go into a passive house that make it kind of easier and more affordable to hit the standard also just make nicer homes.
Well, let's talk a little about that standard, which is the Passive House Institute U.S. standard, or FIUS, PHIUS.
Yeah.
FIUS certification represent in terms of a guarantee that you're getting a passively designed, efficient home?
Yeah, I mean, it is a rigorous standard. There's no question that it carries some weight. It's both in terms of the modeling that has to go into it when it's being designed, but also throughout the construction, there's quite a bit of checks and balances in there, ventilation commissioning at the end. There's a lot of little pieces that just confirm that this is built to quite a high standard. Now, the FIUS standard.
FIUS. I'm sorry, I mispronounced.
FIUS. Okay. Yeah. That standard is very, very interesting as a passive house standard. The world has lots of different passive house standards. The Germans and the Swedes and the Italians, they all have their own. The US standard is very interesting because it's what's called a climate adjusted standard. So unlike, for instance, Germany, which has, a small variety of climates in the entire country, the US has climates from Puerto Rico, Hawaii, northern Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes. I mean, this is an enormous range of climates. And having one standard that meant you got to use, this many kilowatts for heating, whether you were in Alaska or Hawaii, was ridiculous. That was clearly ridiculous. And it took years for them to develop a standard that really responded to climate. I have my own kind of nitpicky issues with the way they've specifically done it, but the idea of it obviously makes sense. And they've done an incredible amount of work to balance those targets to the cost of building a house in any given region. It's a very, very interesting standard from that perspective.
Now, do you also need to work with a FIUS certified contractor in order to have a FIUS certified home?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't believe so, although that may have changed recently as there's more and more certified builders. But the last time we went through certification, you did not need to. You do need to work with other certified people. You need a certified designer and you need a certified rater to come out and check the home and make sure everything's actually working the way it's supposed to. Again, the last 10 years have seen this incredible growth in this. So, whereas that was very difficult to do 10 years ago, now it's getting easier and easier in most regions to achieve that. If you choose to work with a FIUS certified builder, the advantage is that, you don't have to certify to see all of the benefits. Certification is awesome because it holds everyone's feet to the fire and you know what you're getting, but the principles apply whether you're able to build a brand new certified home or not. The same principles can be applied to just what we call a good enough house, a house that's a little bit better than code, but for one reason or another is not going to be able to go all the way to super.
A lot of us can get by with good enough, and I think that
Right? Yeah.
it's an important step to take, is a little better.
Yeah.
But so, what information would you suggest a home buyer or a renter ask about the space they're thinking about purchasing, whether it's a house, apartment, or condominium? Is the heating and cooling cost the most obvious proxy for performance?
Yeah, it is the easiest to check and verify, but it is not the most important. But it's the easiest to do. So
Mhm.
of course that's something you would ask. Um, you know, I've bought a few used homes. I live in an old house,
Mhm.
and as a designer, I like open up walls and then shudder at what I've uncovered inside. It's really really hard to know what you're getting when you just buy a home because it's all covered up. And there are some really critical questions that are almost unanswerable inside there. Energy bills are good. Another thing that would be really interesting that is verifiable and achievable is a blower door test. So that's how much air leaks through here.
Right.
If you can do that as part of a purchase, that gives you a very, very good picture of how drafty it's going to be.
Mhm.
Yes, which is comfort, but also where those leaks are, which can then start to kind of establish how good the air quality is going to be inside. Most homes leak through the basement, and basements tend to have quite low quality air. So that's another interesting question. The other
Hmm.
thing you can look at is the mechanical systems. You can tell a lot by just the amount of care and attention people have put in.
It's the furnace filter dirty, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or is it a furnace or is it a heat pump furnace? Right? There's a certain amount of it just shows a little bit of extra care if you bothered investing in the heat pump as opposed to just using the old oil furnace. That said, conversely, heat pumps cover up a lot of sins because they divide all your heating bills by three, which is
Yes,
really,
they do.
really nice. So you can have a pretty inefficient, awful house and still a very attractive power bill with a heat pump.
This is a really interesting conversation. We're going to take a quick commercial break and be right back. And we are back to continue the conversation with Mike Anderson, CEO and design leader at Passive Design Solutions, about the evolving opportunity to live in a sustainable home. Mike, you work on multifamily projects, and I want to ask, because many apartment dwellers feel trapped by their landlord's investments in old technology, what changes can somebody make to an apartment to make it more efficient, more responsible?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It really depends on the kind of apartment it is and the relationship to the landlord
Hmm.
and property management, what extent you can make any changes at all. Certainly, notwithstanding how important it is that we improve our building stock, people's lifestyle choices is still the biggest energy impact.
Yeah.
And that can be something like, whether you use a dryer or a clothes. It's an enormous impact compared to the coatings you have on your windows, for example.
Hmm.
So if you're in a situation where you're not able to impact your kind of architectural carbon footprint, then there's still a whole heck of a lot that you can do that is lower hanging fruit. If you're in an apartment and you want to kind of tackle that heating and cooling side, there's a little bit that you can do with what I call sailing your home. So,
Okay.
learning how to open and close windows at the right times of day to get nighttime cooling while excluding daytime heat, for example. Making sure you use the blinds to exclude, the sun coming in when that's unwanted, or making sure you raise them up when you do want it in the winter. So, kind of fiddling with the little operational bits that you
Mhm.
do have in order to limit it. What we don't want to have is we don't want to have the air conditioning going full bore with the windows all cranked open when it's super hot and humid outside, right? It's something
Yeah.
that happens because you want that fresh air and it's summertime, but it's so hot now you need the air conditioning. You do need to think about, okay, wait, what am I doing here, and does it make sense, or am I kind of working at cross purposes with all my different systems?
Well, you mentioned lifestyles, and there's some interesting data. Americans are obviously used to living in big, giant, ridiculously inefficient homes. But in recent years, median square footage of new homes has actually started to fall, and it's down about 200 square feet between 2015 and 2020 to only 2,250 feet. What's the emerging consensus about the right size home for a family, say of four, that
Yeah.
produces the optimal environmental footprint?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And people looking for smaller homes is something that I've noticed, but
Mhm.
I wasn't sure if it was a larger trend or just something kind of specific to our little niche. Certainly, construction budgets are a major driver of that. It's just so expensive to build that if you can build less square feet, it's going to be cheaper. And there's a huge amount of inefficiency. Now, what I have not seen is I have not seen people giving up on the things that are driving houses larger: walk-in closets, ensuite bathrooms, these things that are luxuries,
Mhm.
but that do kind of put an upward pressure on home size. The for the reality is, from a lifestyle perspective, the most efficient way for us to live is together in multifamily buildings, especially in cold climates. That's a little less true in hot climates, but definitely in cold climates, the more we can huddle together like penguins, the more efficient it's going to be. I mean, penguins live in Antarctica with no buildings at all, and it's just huddling that does it. Multifamily buildings are incredibly efficient ways of living, and it is a big, big cultural change.
Well, I actually see that in some of the data we were looking at. We noticed that homes are being built with more bedrooms. They're still smaller. And then you've got the accessory dwelling unit, the ADUs are being added in a lot of neighborhoods. How do you see living arrangements beginning to change?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question as well. I mean, I would suspect, again, that's being driven by finances. That it's about costs and having the mortgage helper, and the house was so expensive, you need to have an extra unit to make it affordable. But it's also, I think it's also changing demographics
Mhm.
as people come from cultures that are more used to living multi-generationally, that just starts to filter in a little bit. And it's something like also just generationally, as people get older and their parents get older, all of these things do seem to be playing a bit of a role. And whereas multifamily, as in an apartment building, is probably um, your most efficient possible way of living, that multi-generational single family home is a really interesting intermediate step, right? Where you just get more people in there.
Well, and in fact, my family sort of made this decision around the time of the financial crisis that this home that we are in is something that we share and that we're passing down and that we can invest in to be more efficient and more environmentally responsible. But are banks and lenders ready to finance those kinds of improvements and continuing investment in a home without us picking up and moving? Do you see that changing?
Yeah, we have seen that banks are willing to invest, although I would not say that they are necessarily as excited to invest as I think
Mhm.
they should be. When you offset your ongoing power bills, you have more monthly capital available, which means you should be able to afford a larger mortgage.
Mm.
This is how we have, been able to justify paying a little more to build a house and having to take out maybe a little bit more of a mortgage up front, because in the end you actually end up saving more on a month by month basis when you take into account the payments. Now, interest rates made that a little bit more complicated, as have the decrease in solar panel prices, which has also impacted the way you kind of think about this economically. But notwithstanding that sometimes we have to ask for a couple of different assessments, eventually the banks understand that if you have more money at the end of every month because you're not paying as much power bills, that's a good thing for them. They can give you a bigger mortgage and they can make more. So I would have thought that they would be just delighted about this. They seem to be sort of ambivalent, but it is available.
Do you get a sense of why they're hesitant about it?
Yeah, I don't. I think they don't really understand exactly. I think when an assessor is looking at or an appraiser is looking at a project, they're usually looking at other sales in the market, right?
Yeah,
Like in the
right.
same neighborhood, what houses sold. Well, there isn't enough of a background of energy efficient versus not energy efficient in any particular given neighborhood for them to have any baseline. So I
Yeah.
think it doesn't work with the way that they think about how appraising works. There are some people out there who are starting to challenge that in the kind of financing world, but yeah, but it certainly hasn't seemed to trickle down to everyone quite yet.
Now, you have a catalog of passive and net zero designs that are available from Passive Design Solutions. Tell us about how much do they cost typically and what's involved in once you get the plan building the home?
Yeah. So we started doing stock plans 5 or 6 years ago as a response to the fact that it was just expensive for people to get a custom designed home from an architect. And there wasn't really anyone else out there saying, hey, homes kind of fall into a certain number of categories. And are you looking for a bungalow or a two-story? And here you
Yep.
go. The same way that the vast majority of homes in North America are not designed by architects. They're just designed by builders or draftspeople or bought out of a catalog. We wanted to make that available, but also in the very energy efficient, high performance space. So a plan from us is about $6,000, if I remember correctly. And what that comes with is us meeting with you to help you pick what the right plan is for your site. Because the most important thing is to make sure that the house is going to point the right way, that the front door is on the right side, that it's going to fit your context, that it's going to fit your budget, and that it's going to fit your needs. Once that's kind of narrowed down to a plan or a few plans that you can pick from, then we would embark on a process of modifying it to make it suit you. We've sold a few unmodified plans, but very few. Almost everyone has a change or two to make it their own.
Are the customizations generally fixtures or moving walls?
They can be pretty dramatic. Yeah. As just generally as a firm, we're pretty open to whatever. When it gets up to a certain number of hours, then I believe the quality starts to drop. Like you actually just get a better product out of a custom design if you start really messing with it. But at the same time, there's lots of different climates across North America, and I have a project I was just working on one this morning that's up in Alaska. And we've got projects down in Colorado. Those are very, very different climates. Even if the same basic plan is purchased for the two of them, the construction documents that come out of them are going to be very, very different.
Well, would you suggest getting a contractor before you work with Passive Solutions or not?
Yeah, if you can. I mean, as a designer, I much prefer if a builder's on board. And the reason why is just because then, we can ideally bring them to a meeting and be talking about how they want to build. It reduces the number of changes that have to happen late in the game.
Okay.
So that's really great. The disadvantage is it's pretty hard to get a builder to call you back even if you have building plans right now, let alone if you don't have building plans. If you don't have building plans, you're just not that serious to them necessarily. So we've had people do it both ways. Certainly, all things being equal, it's much, much better to have a builder on board with one caveat. And that's that if a builder knows they're the only one pricing, it does not matter how honest that builder is. There's just this thing that happens where the price maybe isn't quite as good as it could be.
Well, that's the reality of the market we live in. I don't think we can crack that walnut right now. But let me ask this, because you also work on multifamily projects, particularly affordable home projects. And that, of course, is critical to resolving the climate crisis for everyone. Tell me about the Sunflower Court project and how it had to address not just environmental issues, but social issues.
Yeah, that was, a really game-changing project for us in our office after working on mostly single-family homes or duplexes for years, for a decade or more. We got the opportunity to design this multifamily project. And the reason why they came to us was because when it's for a center for women and children. Yeah. And when they crunched their financial numbers, they realized that there was no way they could be paying for power and providing the rents they had to provide in order for people to actually be able to live here for the population they were trying to serve. Basically, they're charging about $300 a month rent. Well, that's what the power bill would be in one. Yeah. It had to be net zero for their financial model to work at all. And so because of that, we got involved and ended up getting to design it. And it's a really, really interesting project and a really interesting problem. What's so different about multifamily compared to single family is that they're much warmer. You have more people. That means more people doing more stuff, cooking, turning lights on and off, having pets. All of these things create heat, right? So
so in an exchanger environment, those heat sources even could be shared.
they can, yeah, it's possible. There's some really neat mechanical systems that are available out there, but even just without intentionally sharing them, you're
Huh?
all in the same bubble, right? You got this thermal envelope bubble. And if someone in the apartment next to you is running on the treadmill, some of that heat's going to come through the wall between your apartments because that wall is generally not insulated.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's soundproof, it's fireproof, but it's not necessarily thermal proof. And at some point, it's going to eventually get through into the rest of the building. When you've got apartments all around you, that's going to all keep you warm. So what it meant is that cooling became this massive issue, even in Nova Scotia, which is like Maine but north and out in the ocean. And so cooling became this really, really big thing for us to have to deal with. And it was something that the client and this population felt that they couldn't manage. So maintenance was everything. It had to be absolutely bomb proof, durable, very, very cheap and simple to maintain. And for that reason, we ended up just using electric baseboards. Heat pumps are so much more efficient. It would have been much, much better way of doing it. But because of the way the buildings were built and constructed and set up, it just didn't need any heat. But it did need cooling. And putting the heat pumps in would have required cooling. And so instead, we started going down this train of what can we do to keep it cool in there.
Right.
For that reason, we ended up not going with an apartment shape. So an apartment shape would mean like, an elevator and interior hallways and doors off of your interior hallway.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we went with townhomes, and which sounds a little bit more fancy, but it actually eliminated the need for cooling because by going with townhomes, we could get a breeze from one wall to the other wall. That's impossible in an apartment. You've got one wall that touches the outside, so you can never get that cross ventilation. Well, it turns out that cross ventilation was enough to eliminate the need for cooling in these buildings, along with a bunch of other little tweaks.
That raises some really interesting questions about where we are with the current built environment and what we can upgrade over the course of the next decade or two as we're trying to lower our overall emissions. How much of the world do we need to rebuild versus upgrade in the next decade?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because in some ways, the easiest thing for us to do to have an impact long term is change building codes, right? If we change building codes now, in some ways, you can just do it with the stroke of a pen. And then 100 years in the future, most of our building stock is at this very, very high standard. And as long as we set our building codes ambitious enough, we could be building future buildings right now.
Sure.
But in the short to medium term, that doesn't have quite the impact we need it to have to deal with the climate crisis. We have to be dealing with existing buildings. Mm-hmm. And we just are not building enough fast enough to be replacing all of the old inefficient stuff. We have to also come up with this kind of like critical time not to die package of retrofit upgrades to existing homes. And that's all of the homes, right? Single families, duplexes, townhomes, low rises, even arguably high rises. And they would all have very different, depending on climate and depending on typology, they would have very different strategies that would make each one better. Certainly some of it is adding insulation. Certainly some of it is air tightness or windows. And the problem with retrofits and renovations is that there just is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It is project by project. It depends on what else needs to be done and what the context is and what money is available and all of that.
Are there transformative progress in energy efficiency or in other technologies that people should be aware of as they think about their next home in order to integrate that idea into where they're going to live?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest game-changing technology from an operational carbon perspective has been heat pumps, for sure. And the reason why is because, as I said earlier, you can cover all sorts of sins with a good heat pump because it's so efficient at heating that you can make a terrible home and put a heat pump in it, and hey, you cut your heating bill in half. So that is a very, very good thing for retrofits. If you can change one mechanical system and cut your power bill in half without doing anything to your envelope, I mean, that's incredible. So that's a really important technology to be aware of. And it's something that I'm sure there's all sorts of, back end environmental issues with it as it starts to roll out at a large scale. But in terms of reducing heating and cooling energy usage, it's definitely something to be aware of. The other really unbelievable game changer is solar panels, photovoltaic panels, and the way that the cost has come down so dramatically in the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
Where, even 6 or 7 years ago, I think I was pricing at $4 a watt, and now it's down around $2 a watt where I am. And I would expect that you would get much better payback in really, really sunny places as well.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that's always shifting the math. So we're always looking at it saying, okay, is it worth putting on that extra inch of insulation? It's foam, right? So foam has its cost. Or is it better to put on another 2 panels of solar? Because that's what we're talking about here. And then there's cost in terms of dollars, and there's also cost in terms of global warming potential. And as solar changes its price, that foam that was totally worthwhile 2 years ago is no longer worthwhile. It's actually better to just put the solar panel.
Well, and these are the kinds of trade-offs that we need to inculcate into our thinking and begin to use as criteria for making decisions about our next home or how we're going to upgrade our current home. How can folks follow along with your thinking and learn more about all of the designs that Passive Design Solutions offers?
Yeah, well, come visit us at our website. We do have a newsletter on there that you can be part of. We try to make it interesting and informative, not just about whatever the new stock plans are, but also some of our thinking about how we approach these things. Retrofits are not as much of our specialty, but it's something that I think is absolutely critically important. And there's a really interesting initiative called the Recover Initiative that I'm not affiliated with, but that I'm following. And it's a really, really neat prefabricated panel that they're talking about bolting onto the outside of low-rise apartments. So that's really, really interesting. And of course, there's a huge ecosystem of people out there trying to lower our operational carbon in buildings.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for spending some time with us today. It's been really informative.
Right on. Thank you very much, Mitch.
We've been speaking with Mike Anderson, CEO of Passive Design Solutions, a pioneer in net zero passive home design and building. You can learn more about them at passivedesign.ca. Passive Design is all one word, no space, no dash, passivedesign.ca. Net zero and passive home designs are two important converging themes in the building industry. But as we've heard, it's still very much early days, and we need to reduce the environmental impact of how we live faster than our buildings can be upgraded. So each of us have to make some choices to make our home more sustainable or spend the same money, for instance, on reducing other impacts, such as switching to an EV or choosing locally grown foods. Understanding these trade-offs is important, not just for the world, but for our personal finances. Take some time to learn about passive home design and see if some of those ideas can be applied in your current home. Can you seal the space better? Can you upgrade the windows and fixtures for improved efficiency? And how can these investments improve the long-term value or the long-term cost of living in your home or townhome? It's a time for learning, and we'll keep you tuned in to the opportunity to reduce your footprint in every aspect of your life. I hope you'll take a minute to share this podcast or any of the more than 400 interviews we've done on sustainability in your ear with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Writing a review on your favorite podcast platform will help your neighbors find us. Please be the amplifiers that spread more ideas so we can create less waste. Tell your friends, family, everyone you know that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness that they prefer. Thank you so much, folks, for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.